Chapter 37. Fear. "Time to get up, sweetie," Reyes whispered gently to his wife. The bed they had spent the night in had been reasonably comfortable. It was one of only 2 double rooms they had had at the inn, and as a result of its size, the bed took up most of the room. There was also a small table against one of the walls on which was sitting an unlit candle. There was no chair to go with the table, and no sign of any cupboards where Reyes and his wife could have stored clothing, had they been wearing any. A small window located just above the headboard of the bed allowed a modicum of light into the room. It was enough light for Reyes to see across the room to the door that led to the rest of the inn. Enough light for him to realise that the sun had risen above the horizon, and it was time to get up and get underway again. Gaggara groaned. She snuggled into her pillow a little more and muttered almost silently, as if it was too much effort to speak properly. Just a few more minutes. Reyes couldn't help but smile. It was a very comfortable bed. He would have liked to stay here himself. He reached over and kissed his wife lovingly on the cheek. "We need to get a start, my love. We'd better get up." Gaggara opened her eyes and looked at him weakly. "I suppose you're right." Still, she seemed to hesitate to move. Then she said, "Wouldn't it be nice to just stay here in each other's arms? Let's just spend half an hour together." She reached up and tried to drag him down towards her. "Gaggara, please," Reyes replied. He leaned in close to kiss Gaggara again, when he broke free of her embrace and swung his legs out of the bed. Reyes stood beside the bed for a moment, part of him wanting to return to his wife and take full advantage of her invitation. Eventually, Reyes forced himself to walk over to the small table, where, with a little bit of magic, he lit the candle. Reyes had already been able to see most of the room with the help of the sunlight alone, and the candle did little to increase the overall luminescence. Before he made his way to the door of their room, Reyes glanced once more at the half-asleep figure of his beloved wife, lying quite still on her side of the bed, but watching him with a slight smile on her face. "Don't be too long," he suggested. "I'll meet you in the bar room as soon as you're ready." Gaggara blinked her lovely eyes in a most alluring manner and replied, "You're still male, handsome." "I'm still," Reyes repeated at first, wondering what that had to do with anything. Then he realised he hadn't yet switched his body to its female form. He did so now. His body settled easily into its new configuration. He still felt funny when he took on this appearance. He felt stranger like this when he did when he was playing at being a human. In a city where there were so many harpies in the air, such a disguise was pretty much a requirement. "Better," Gaggara said. Then she added, "I guess." She didn't sound all that happy. Reyes reached for the handle of the door and opened it. He was blasted in the face by the smell of many lovely things. By the smell of it, the barman had put on quite a feast for his guests this morning, and somehow the door of their room had stopped either Reyes or Gaggara from smelling it properly, until now. "I'm getting up," Gaggara said eagerly. The inn was very small. It only had 6 rooms. 2 of these rooms, the 2 that were located at the very end of the corridor furthest from the bar room, were the double rooms. The other 4 rooms were all intended for single occupancy. Reyes and Gaggara had spent the night in the first of the 2 double rooms, while Quinnigoff had slept in the single room next to them, and Tenegi had spent her night in the single room next door to her. Quinnigoff had insisted that she be in that room. Its location right next to Reyes and Gaggara's room meant that she could listen out for trouble during the night and answer any such call in an instant. Reyes would admit that he felt quite self-conscious about having Quinnigoff in the room next door to where he and Gaggara were sleeping. The walls were far too thin to begin with, and kept out very little of the noise. Then there was Quinnigoff's superior harpy hearing. Gaggara, though, really didn't seem to care if anyone did overhear them during the night, and she made no attempts to muffle what she said, or any other noises she made. As Reyes passed the doors where Quinnigoff and Tenegi had been staying, he knocked on each of them twice, calling, "Time to get up." He needn't have bothered. Both of Reyes' bodyguards were already in the barroom of the inn, taking full advantage of the spread that the Minotaur barman had provided for them. Although the barman was a Minotaur, sadly it wasn't their old friend Orsa. Reyes hadn't really expected that it would be. Indeed, he would have been more than slightly surprised if it had been. Reyes just couldn't imagine his old friend Orsa trying to run a bar anywhere. The owner of the inn had originally been a soldier. He had once been a member of the 733rd Hope and had lost an eye during the early days of the war. He now wore a patch to hide the wound. Since most of the rest of his regiment had been slaughtered during the same battle, the Minotaur considered himself to have come out on top. The regiment had been disbanded, the survivors dispersed to other regiments of the Hope, except for a few who were wounded, such as the owner of this inn, who somehow managed to slip between the cracks of the paperwork and had escaped the army altogether. Reyes had found out the personal history of the Minotaur last night. The two of them had chatted together for most of the night, with Gaggara making the occasional observation and finally insisting it was time for bed and dragging her husband off to their room. There had even been a time during their chatting last night when Reyes had been on the verge of offering to regenerate the Minotaur's eye for him. He resisted the temptation. He didn't feel it was wise to reveal that he had any kind of magical ability in what was ostensibly a hostile city. Another thing that happened last night was that Reyes had effectively bought the inn. He hadn't meant to, it was just that the only coins he had on his person were the handful of gold and silver coins that Mangloss had given him. When he handed one of the silver coins to the Minotaur in payment for the drinks and the rooms, the Minotaur's remaining eye almost seemed to bulge out of his socket. "I can't change this, ma'am," the Minotaur had said. "The place is yours." "What?" Reyes had replied, a little confused at the time. "The inn, the food, the drinks, the rooms. Take your pick. If you want me to go and fetch anything special for you, just say the word," the Minotaur told him. "I don't want the inn," Reyes had replied. "You may keep the inn." Reyes wasn't sure, but he actually thought the Minotaur looked a little saddened by his comment. "Just give me whatever other money you happen to have in the place at the moment, and keep the food and drinks coming." This, no doubt, was why when Reyes had opened the door of his and Gaggara's room, his nostrils had been assailed by such a wide and tempting array of smells. It was a small barroom. There were only 4 tables in front of the bar for the guests to sit at. Last night, though, the place had been quite empty. Other than the 4 harpies, there had been no one in the place. This morning it was just as empty. The inn was simply too far out of the way. So the Minotaur had pushed the 4 tables together to make one very large table in the middle of the barroom. It was on these 4 tables that a lavish banquet had been laid out for the harpies. Quinagoff was sat at one of the tables, gorging herself. Tanegi was on her feet, standing by the corridor that led to the rooms, as if she was on guard. She had the well-cooked leg bone of a pig in her hand, and was liberally taking bites. Reyes patted Tanegi on the shoulders and walked over to the table. Now that Reyes was in the barroom, Tanegi evidently thought she was no longer needed to keep watch on the corridor to the rooms, and she also came and joined them at the table. Gaggara arrived only a few seconds later. As large as the spread was that the barman had cooked for them, the 4 hungry harpies were easily able to devour most of it. "No offence," Reyes said, aiming his comments mainly at his 2 bodyguards, "but I think this is the best meal I've had since we started this trip." "No offence taken," my chief, Quinagoff voiced. "I'm in full agreement." "Just think," Tanegi said wistfully as she grabbed another handful of meat off the table. "This could be our last meal together." "She's been saying cheerful things like that, my chief," Quinagoff commented. "Fun little things, such as, we could all be dead tomorrow." "Well, we could," Tanegi said. "We are going off to war." "We could," Reyes agreed, "but we shouldn't dwell on such things. An elven patrol might enter this inn and decide to use us for target practice within the next 5 minutes. Alternately, the 4 of us could all be alive and well as the sun sets tonight." Tanegi nodded. "I hope you're right." "Shut up and eat," Quinagoff insisted. Reyes sighed. Things were going to get hectic later, and Tanegi was right. There was a good chance that none of them would be alive to see the sun rise on another day. This was going to be a battle in which they were going to be greatly outnumbered. It was true that man for man the human soldiers were better than the elves, but with at least 70 harpy villages facing against them, things were likely to get quite nasty. It was strange how the thing that scared Reyes the most wasn't the possibility that he might be dead before nightfall. It was that his wife, Gaggara, might be killed while he survived. "Gaggara, sweetie," Reyes said, leaning over the table towards her. "I'd feel happier if you sat out this coming battle. Stay here in First Town. Once the fighting is over, I'll come and—" "What?" Gaggara sounded quite indignant. Her expression suggested that she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you telling me you don't want me to fight?" "I couldn't live with myself if anything happened to you," Reyes told her. Gaggara gave him one of her gentler and cuter smiles, and then she replied softly, "And I couldn't live with myself if anything happened to you. Yet I know you have to go. No, I'm coming with you. That's all there is to it." Reyes sighed and nodded. Jenny had used almost the exact same argument to force her husband into letting her fight in the coming battle. Jenny and Gaggara had obviously chatted together about things other than just weddings. Reyes knew there would be no point in arguing further. Gaggara had given the answer he had expected. He knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't be dissuaded. Once Reyes had eaten all he could, he climbed to his feet and walked over to the bar. He pulled out his money pouch and placed a couple of the dollar the barman had given him back on the counter. "It's a lovely spread. Please take this as a sign of our regard." "It's really not necessary, ma'am," the barman replied. "Please," Reyes said, "I insist." Busy day today, ma'am? The barman asked. Yes, we're flying over to Arliss. Reyes hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had gotten so friendly with this barman that he had almost given the entire plan away. He coughed to cover the pause. Sorry, tickle. Yes, we're flying over to Arliss to scout out a suitable location for our village. I'm not sure what you harpies see in that island, the barman commented. I see entire flocks flying over there on a daily basis. It has a mountain, Reyes replied simply. We like to be high up, we like to see our surroundings. Well, the barman said in a friendly tone, I hope you find a good place. There can't be much room left over there. Reyes stepped away from the bar and headed towards the door of the inn. Let's go, girls, we want to get there early. Quinagoff moved quickly. She was out of her chair and by the inn door in less than a second. I should lead the way. She opened the door and headed out into the city. Back at the table, Gaggara grabbed a few loose morsels and carried them with her. She walked, not to the door of the inn, but to her husband, falling in step with him. The door wasn't large enough for the two of them to exit together, so Reyes did move slightly ahead, but once out in the street, he turned and waited for Gaggara to join him. Tinegi brought up the rear, waiting for Reyes and Gaggara to leave the inn before she even left her chair. There should be no threat in the bar, since the only one left was the barman, but she kept her eyes on him as she walked to the door, as if he might suddenly strike them from behind. By the time Tinegi stepped through the door, Quinagoff had already taken to the air. This was it, Reyes thought to himself, the last leg of their journey from Damoth to Arliss. It was just a short distance to the harbour wall, and from there a 3-mile flight across wide open water to the island of Arliss itself. Reyes closed his eyes at the thought. He couldn't help it, but was beginning to feel a little sick. He had imagined flying all the way to the harbour wall before. That was easy. The journey from Damoth to First Town was all over land. There were only a few wide rivers to cross, and over the last year or so, Reyes had gotten into the habit of just closing his eyes, gritting his teeth, and making a mad dash for the opposite bank. Reyes tried to take his mind off of it. He looked at the streets of the city below and the activity of the various people going about their everyday business. As he got closer to the harbour, he watched the antics of the harpies that were already gathered there. Some of them seemed to be having some sort of friendly aerobatics competition between themselves. Fortunately, harpies was such a common sight in this part of the city that no one even seemed to consider challenging Reyes or his girls. The closer Reyes got to the water, the more his body began to shiver with the fear of what he saw ahead. Not the sight of it so much, but the thought that he was going to have to fly over it. In the end, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. He landed on the harbour wall and started to breathe heavily, panic setting in. Handsome, Gaggara said worriedly, coming to land next to him. Are you all right? Reyes looked at her, and then he glanced up at Quinagoff, who, having pushed on over the water, now turned around in mid-air and started to head back. All my life I've had this fear of drowning. I don't know why. The moat around my father's castle terrified me. I used to love standing at the very edge of the highest tower of the castle. I could see a lot from there. I wasn't scared that I might fall and splatter myself across the countryside. I was scared that I might fall and land in the moat and drown. Gaggara looked across the water. The island of Arliss was in sight, as were a vast number of ships moored between the island and the mainland. It's only about 3 miles, handsome. I have trouble flying over rivers, Reyes told her. I manage it, but it still isn't easy for me. I'm not sure I'm capable of crossing a stretch of water this large. Well, Gaggara said soothingly, you won't know unless you try. She jumped from her perch on the harbour wall and started to fly across the water. Hey, Quinagoff said. She'd been hovering just above where Reyes and Gaggara had landed and was taken by surprise. She hurried to get in front of Gaggara and once again was leading the way. Slowly, reluctantly, Reyes launched himself from the top of the sea wall. Yes, this shouldn't be a problem. He was a big, strong harpy. His wings were perfectly capable of carrying him across 3 miles of open land, so why not open water? He never feared falling out of the sky normally, so why should it seem so likely that he would do so now? Reyes looked down at the water, the blue-green waves of the ocean making their way steadily towards the land. The way the sun glinted off each wave, always exactly the same angle. The ocean was beautiful. The ocean was deadly. If flying across this short body of water was so safe, then why did the sea seem to be getting rougher the further from the coast he got? Why did he feel as if the water was just lurking down there, waiting for him to get close enough for it to reach up and grab him? And why did his wings start to feel so heavy? It was as if every beat of his wings was an effort. He couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it. Reyes turned around and began to fly back towards the harbour wall. Every beat of his wings felt harder than the last. For some reason he was tiring very quickly, and although he wasn't that far out over the water, he was uncertain that he even had the strength to get back. It was quite the relief when his feet touched the top of the harbour wall again, and he almost collapsed to his knees. He was breathing very heavily, almost panting. Gaggara landed beside him again a few seconds later. "Handsome?" she said worriedly. "I can't do it," Reyes told her, climbing unsteadily back to his feet. I just can't do it." "You must," Gaggara told him. "Your sister is relying on you." Reyes nodded. Gaggara knew how to motivate him. The entire human race was relying on him, but he had a stronger rapport with his sister than he did with anyone else. "I need a few minutes to get my strength back." "Handsome, darling," Gaggara said. She found his ear with her tongue and licked it gently. "Please don't," Reyes said. "Not now." "I have a suggestion," Gaggara whispered, "but I'm not sure you're going to like it." "At the moment I'm open to anything," Reyes replied. He turned his head so that she no longer had access to his ears, at least not with her tongue. "Let me carry you across the water," Gaggara suggested. Reyes looked out at the island. "It's a long way, my angel. I know you're strong enough, but it will be quite tiring for you." There were other parts of this that Reyes didn't like. "What is more, I will still be dangling over the water. I will still be able to see the water. I'd feel just as rotten, and yet I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. There's also the problem that if any other harpy were to catch sight of us like that, she is likely to get very suspicious." Gaggara laughed. "You really are slow sometimes, aren't you?" She lovingly stroked his shoulder. "Am I?" Reyes felt a little hurt, but only a little. Gaggara looked across the water to the island. "How long do you think it would take me to fly from here to there?" "I don't really think it would take more than 10 minutes, but for me that's 10 minutes of terror. 10 minutes that will seem to go on forever. 10 minutes when my wings will stop doing what they're told and it becomes an effort to even stay in the air." "What I'm suggesting is that you travel in the painting," Gaggara said. "Teach me how to use the ring. I will wear it and I will carry you over the water in the painting." Reyes shivered at the thought. It was strange how he still had certain human sensibilities. He loved Gaggara. He would do anything for her, but to entrust the entire human race to a harpy who had been brought up as a harpy, somehow the whole thing went against the grain. He steeled himself. He knew he had to get over his doubts. This was his wife. If he couldn't trust her, then who could he trust? He looked at her and nodded. "I guess that might work." Gaggara smiled. She leaned in a little and kissed him. Reyes prepared to remove the ring from his finger so that he could hand it to Gaggara right there and then. He hesitated to do so. Although he and Gaggara had found a relatively quiet part of the harbour on which they could have their chat, there were still so many harpies in the general direction that Reyes felt it was simply too dangerous to take the ring off. Doing so would cause him to revert to his natural sex. The moment any of the harpies currently flying around the area caught sight of a male out in the open, there was a good chance that they would attack just for the sake of it, as well as for the face they would gain from their village for killing a potential rival to their own male. With no eyes in the sky watching over them, there was a good chance that they would get away with it. "We should return to the inn," Reyes told his wife. He let go of the ring. "I'll show you how to use the ring there." "There won't be room in the inn for the painting," Gaggara replied. "Maybe not," Reyes accepted, "although the bar room might be big enough. We could always set it up in the street just outside the inn." Then he whispered back to his wife, "I don't think it's safe to become male here." "I understand," Gaggara acknowledged. Then she took to the air and started to fly back into the midst of the city, and Reyes followed her close behind. "Where are you going?" Quinnigoff called, evidently so flustered that Reyes and Gaggara were now flying in the wrong direction that she forgot to add her usual honorific. "Back to the inn," Reyes called over his shoulder. "Just for a few minutes." "But," Quinnigoff said. Then she added, "Yes, my chief." And with Tanegi she began to follow. "Gah," Reyes thought to himself. "Could she have yelled that any louder with so many harpies from other villages in the area?" She certainly seemed to have attracted a lot of attention towards both Reyes and Gaggara. Fortunately, none of the other harpies in the area gave Reyes or Gaggara any more than a quick cursory look before they returned to what they were doing. It seemed the mere fact that he appeared to be female was enough.